Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator, the crisp scent of antiseptic, the hushed murmur of monitors. These were the symphonies of Joseph's life. At 63, he moved through the surgical ward with the quiet grace of a seasoned conductor, each gesture precise, each word measured. His hands, gnarled from decades of scrubbing and gloving, still possessed a surgeon's dexterity when threading an IV line or assisting with a tricky intubation. He was Joseph, the surgical nurse, a pillar of scientific precision in a world often swayed by emotion. His contentment was a quiet, steady flame, fueled by the unwavering belief in the tangible, the verifiable, the meticulously charted. His small, meticulously organized apartment, a sanctuary of polished wood and well-worn medical texts, echoed the order of his professional life. Every book spine aligned, every surface dusted, every tea bag in its designated slot. He found immense satisfaction in this curated existence, a counterpoint to the controlled chaos of the operating room. His colleagues, a mix of ambitious young residents and jaded veterans, respected him. Patients, despite their pain or fear, often found solace in his calm efficiency, his steady gaze that promised competence, not platitudes. Dr. Anya Sharma, his usual surgeon, once remarked, "Joseph, you're the only person who can make a laparotomy feel like a finely choreographed ballet." He'd offered a small, almost imperceptible smile in return. His only living relative, Ilara, his grandniece, was a vibrant splash of chaotic color in his monochrome world. Their weekly Sunday calls were a predictable dance of mild exasperation and underlying affection. Today, the phone buzzed against the polished mahogany of his bedside table. Displaying her name, he picked up, a faint sigh escaping him. "Uncle Joe, guess what?" Her voice, bright and effervescent, crackled through the line. "I'm back from the Sedona retreat, so transformative. You have to try energy healing. It's like recalibrating your very essence." Joseph pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ilara, dear, you know my stance on energy healing and recalibrating essences. It sounds like airy-fairy nonsense. Did you at least get some decent art done?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Oh, you and your science. But yes, the desert light was incredible. Anyway, how's work? Still saving lives with your scalpels and your very precise nursing?" "Still saving lives with evidence-based practice, yes," he replied, a hint of weariness in his tone that he tried to mask. He'd had a particularly long shift, and a strange, dull ache had been simmering in his upper abdomen all day. He attributed it to the strong coffee and the skipped lunch. Nothing a good night's sleep couldn't fix. The gnawing ache had become a persistent companion, a low-grade hum beneath the surface of his ordered life. Initially, he dismissed it as indigestion, the occupational hazard of a nurse who often ate on the run. He tried antacids, then a bland diet, meticulously charting the effects like a scientific experiment. But the discomfort persisted, a subtle pressure that tightened after meals, even small ones. He found himself leaving half his meticulously prepared meals untouched, a strange feeling of fullness settling in his stomach after only a few bites. He, Joseph, the man who prided himself on his unwavering constitution, felt a creeping fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. It was a bone-deep weariness, not the satisfying exhaustion after a long shift, but a pervasive lethargy that clung to him like a damp shroud. One morning, he'd found himself staring at his reflection, noting the sharper angles of his cheekbones, the slight hollows beneath his eyes. He'd always been lean, but this was different. He'd stepped onto his bathroom scale, a rarely used instrument, and frowned at the number. 5 pounds down. He rationalized it as stress, perhaps a touch of dehydration from the hospital's dry air. A few weeks later, the numbers on the scale were starker. A full 15 pounds had vanished, seemingly overnight. Despite no conscious effort to diet, he tried to ignore the growing unease, applying the same detached medical reasoning he used for his patients. Early satiety, unexplained weight loss, upper abdominal discomfort. He mentally ran through a differential diagnosis, dismissing the more ominous possibilities with a professional shrug. Gastritis, perhaps a stubborn H. pylori infection. He'd even started a course of over-the-counter proton pump inhibitors, hoping to self-treat and avoid the fuss of a doctor's visit. One Tuesday, during a particularly chaotic morning on the ward, the nausea hit with a vengeance. He'd been assisting Dr. Sharma with a complex dressing change when a wave of dizziness and sour bile rose in his throat. He'd excused himself abruptly, making it to the nearest utility sink just in time, discreetly retching into it. He'd blamed it on a stomach bug, a common occurrence in a hospital. Later that day, a junior nurse, fresh out of training, had paused by his station. "Mr. Davies," she'd said, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you feeling all right? You look a bit gaunt today." He'd forced a thin smile. "Just a touch under the weather, Nurse Jenkins. Nothing a strong cup of tea won't fix." He'd dismissed her, but her words, laced with genuine worry, had echoed in his mind. The carefully constructed wall of professional detachment he used to medicalize his own symptoms was starting to crack. The discomfort was no longer ignorable. It was becoming undeniable. The sudden, sharp pain that doubled him over was the breaking point. It hit him in the middle of the night, a searing, twisting agony in his upper abdomen that left him gasping for breath, cold sweat beading on his forehead. This was no mere indigestion. This was a scream from his own anatomy, a demand for attention he could no longer ignore. The next morning, his face pale and drawn, he called his own doctor, a younger general practitioner he occasionally referred patients to. He requested a full workup: blood tests, endoscopy, CT scan. He articulated his symptoms with the same clinical precision he would expect from a colleague, omitting any hint of personal fear. The doctor's office was stark, the white walls reflecting the harsh reality of fluorescent light. Joseph sat, hands clasped, listening to Dr. Evans deliver the news. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, each syllable a hammer blow to his carefully constructed scientific world. "Joseph, the endoscopy revealed a large mass in your stomach, and the CT, it shows widespread involvement. We're looking at stage 4 gastric adenocarcinoma with peritoneal carcinomatosis." Dr. Evans's voice was gentle, empathetic, but devoid of false hope. "Given the stage and spread, the prognosis is extremely challenging. We're talking about palliative care, Joseph. Managing symptoms, extending quality of life for as long as possible." Joseph felt a strange, cold detachment. It was as if he were observing a patient, not receiving his own death sentence. He mentally processed the information. Adenocarcinoma, aggressive, often late stage at diagnosis. Peritoneal carcinomatosis, spread to the abdominal lining, notoriously difficult to treat. His mind, the same mind that had dissected countless medical charts, now dissected his own impending demise. There was no anger, not yet, only a profound, chilling disbelief. His own body, this magnificent biological machine he understood so intimately, had betrayed him in the most fundamental way. Just as the sterile silence pressed in, the door burst open. Ilara, her usually vibrant face streaked with tears, rushed in, her bohemian scarf askew. She'd somehow found out, probably from his flustered GP. "Uncle Joe!" she sobbed, collapsing onto a chair, her eyes wide with desperate concern. "Oh my God, Uncle Joe, no!" She reached for his hand, but he instinctively recoiled, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy, the raw display of emotion. "Ilara, please," he said, his voice flat. "Control yourself. This is a doctor's office." She ignored him, her voice rising with a frantic energy. "But there are things. Energy healing. I saw a shaman in Sedona who cured. He cured someone of a brain tumor. We can try acupuncture, special diets, Reiki. There are holistic approaches, Uncle Joe. You don't have to just give up and let them pump you full of poison." He finally looked at her, his eyes cold, devoid of the compassion he offered his patients. "Ilara," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "I am a man of science. I have spent my life dedicated to the verifiable, the empirical. Do not insult me with your airy-fairy nonsense. There is no shaman, no crystal, no energy healing that will cure stage 4 gastric adenocarcinoma. This is grim. This is real. and your ridiculous suggestions are nothing but a distraction from the cold, hard facts." He turned back to Dr. Evans, his face a mask of professional resolve, though a deep personal dread gnawed at him. The orderly world he had so carefully curated had just shattered into a million pieces, and the only person offering him comfort was suggesting something he considered entirely unscientific, entirely illogical. He felt a profound fear, yes, but also a simmering anger at his own body's betrayal, and a deep-seated frustration with Alara's unscientific, almost willfully ignorant suggestions. The rhythm of his life had been broken, replaced by the discordant, terrifying beat of an unthinkable diagnosis. His only living relative, his grandniece Alara, was a vibrant, often exasperating counterpoint to his methodical world. Their conversations, usually brief and punctuated by long silences, often revolved around her latest spiritual pursuit. Just last week, during one of their terse phone calls, she'd enthused about a transformative energy healing retreat in Sedona. Joseph had simply grunted, a sound that conveyed his usual dismissal of such airy-fairy nonsense. He believed in facts, in evidence, in the tangible results of skilled hands and well-researched pharmaceuticals. The mysteries of the universe, if they existed, were not to be found in crystals or chakras, but in the intricate dance of molecules and the marvels of human anatomy. Then, a subtle shift began. It started innocently enough, a gnawing ache in his upper abdomen, mild and intermittent, which he promptly attributed to the hospital cafeteria's questionable meatloaf or an overlooked antacid. Being a nurse, he prided himself on his ability to self-diagnose, often with a detached, clinical air. He'd simply adjust his diet, maybe take an extra Tums, but the ache persisted, a low thrum beneath the surface of his otherwise ordered life. He noticed a strange feeling of fullness, an early satiety that meant he'd push away his dinner plate after only a few bites, despite a lingering hunger. He'd rationalize it as a natural consequence of aging, a slowing metabolism. The fatigue, however, was harder to dismiss. It wasn't the pleasant weariness after a long shift, but a pervasive exhaustion that seeped into his bones, making even the simplest tasks feel Herculean. He found himself nodding off during his evening news, a habit unheard of for the man who meticulously tracked global events. He began to skip his usual mid-morning apple, the thought of its crisp sweetness suddenly unappealing. One Tuesday, during a particularly grueling appendectomy, he felt a wave of nausea so intense it forced him to step away from the sterile field, a rare occurrence that drew a concerned glance from Dr. Evans, the lead surgeon. Joseph merely waved a dismissive hand, blaming a touch of the flu. Later that day, as he meticulously charted post-op notes, a junior nurse, fresh-faced and earnest, paused beside his desk. "Mr. Davies," she began, her brow furrowed with genuine worry. "Are you feeling all right? You look a bit gaunt." Joseph managed a tight smile, brushing off her concern. "Just a busy week, Nurse Miller. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." But as he caught his reflection in the darkened computer screen, he saw it too. A sharper angle to his jaw, a hollowness beneath his eyes he hadn't noticed before. He attributed it to the fluorescent lights, the stress of the job, anything but a deeper malaise. The scale in his bathroom, usually a static confirmation of his disciplined routine, began to tell a different story, a silent, creeping descent that he tried to ignore, then rationalize, then, finally with a growing sense of unease, could no longer deny. The meticulous order of his life was beginning to fray at the edges, not from external chaos, but from a subtle, insidious disquiet within. The gnawing ache became a searing pain, a sharp, sudden agony that doubled him over in the quiet sanctity of his apartment one evening. He clutched his stomach, his breath catching in ragged gasps, the clinical detachment he usually applied to his own body utterly dissolving into pure, primal fear. This was no meatloaf indigestion. This was something far more sinister. The next morning, paler than usual, with a tremor in his hand he couldn't quite control, he called his own physician, Dr. Ben Carter, a colleague he'd known for decades. The appointment was swift, the concern in Ben's eyes unmistakable. A battery of tests followed, blood work, an endoscopy, eventually a CT scan. Joseph went through the motions, a part of his mind still clinging to the hope of a benign explanation, a nasty ulcer perhaps, or a severe case of gastritis. He was a nurse, he understood the odds, but he was also Joseph, the man who believed in control, in the scientific method, in the predictable course of illness and recovery. The call came on a Tuesday. Ben's voice was somber, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Joseph, can you come in? We need to talk about your results." Joseph knew, even before he heard the words, the prognosis. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a physical manifestation of the darkness that was already growing inside him. He sat in Dr. Carter's office, the sterile white walls suddenly closing in, the air thick with unspoken truths. Ben, usually so direct, began with a preamble about the complexity of the human body, the unpredictable nature of disease. Joseph cut him off, his voice flat. "Just tell me, Ben. Don't sugarcoat it." Ben took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Joseph's with a profound sadness. "Joseph, it's stage 4 gastric adenocarcinoma with peritoneal carcinomatosis." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Joseph felt a strange sensation, as if he were floating above his own body, observing the scene. He heard Ben continue, explaining the grim picture, the advanced stage, the spread, the focus on palliative care. "We can try chemotherapy, Joseph, to slow progression, manage symptoms, but a cure isn't realistic at this stage." For a moment, Joseph felt nothing but a profound, icy shock. Then a wave of anger, hot and furious, washed over him. Anger at his own body's betrayal, at the insidious enemy that had silently taken root within him. Anger at the futility of his decades spent healing others, only to be struck down by something he couldn't fight, couldn't control. He, the meticulous nurse, the master of precision, was now a victim of biological chaos. Just as Ben finished explaining the treatment options, or lack thereof, the door to the office burst open, Elara. She stood there, her usually vibrant face pale with shock, her artistic clothes rumpled, as if she'd driven straight from her latest retreat. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, were wide with unshed tears. She must have called Ben, sensing something amiss. "Joseph!" she cried, rushing to his side, her hand reaching for his, which he instinctively recoiled from. "Oh, Joseph, no! This can't be happening!" She turned to Ben, her voice rising in a desperate plea. "What about alternative therapies? Energy healing? Holistic approaches? There must be something." Joseph felt a fresh surge of irritation, a cold, scientific detachment mixed with a deep personal dread. He looked at Elara, her face a mask of distraught hope, and saw only a desperate clinging to fantasy. "Elara," he said, his voice clipped, "this isn't some New Age crystal session. This is cancer. Stage 4. It's reality, and there is no magic cure." He felt a profound weariness, a crushing weight settling upon him. The carefully constructed edifice of his life, built on logic and hard facts, had just crumbled. The quiet contentment was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow dread. The rhythms of care had given way to the discordant notes of a death sentence. The gnawing ache, once a fleeting annoyance, had become a constant companion, a dull, persistent throb that seemed to anchor itself just beneath his sternum. Joseph, ever the pragmatist, had escalated his self-treatment, stronger antacids, then dietary changes, meticulously eliminating suspect foods one by one. But the discomfort persisted, growing more insistent, like a demanding child refusing to be ignored. He found himself excusing himself from the nurse's station more frequently, a quiet hand pressed to his abdomen, hoping no one noticed the slight furrow in his brow. Then came the weight loss. It was insidious at first, a pound here, 2 there, easily dismissed as the result of increased activity or perhaps a minor stomach bug. But then his scrubs began to hang a little looser, his watch strap needed an extra notch, and the sharp angles of his cheekbones became more pronounced. 30 pounds in 2 months. Even his practiced medical rationalizations couldn't explain that away. He tried to eat more, forcing down meals even when a strange, instant fullness settled in his stomach after only a few bites. The nausea, too, had joined the unwelcome chorus of symptoms, a subtle queasiness that often escalated into a full-blown wave, leaving him clammy and weak. He'd learned to discreetly excuse himself to the nearest restroom, convinced he could manage it, that he would manage it. One afternoon, during a particularly busy shift, a junior nurse, Sarah, who usually bustled around with cheerful energy, paused beside him. "Mr. Joseph," she began hesitantly, her brow creased with concern, "are you feeling all right? You look, a bit drawn." Joseph forced a smile, a practiced, professional mask. "Just a touch under the weather, Sarah. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." He waved a dismissive hand, turning back to chart entries, but the comment lingered, a barbed hook in his carefully constructed edifice of control. He knew he looked ill. He could see it in the mirror each morning. The sallow complexion, the dark circles under his eyes, the increasing prominence of his collarbones. The nurse in him was screaming for intervention. The man in him was stubbornly resisting. He began to cut back on his hours, citing vague personal appointments, something he'd never done in his long, unblemished career. His colleagues, accustomed to his unwavering presence, exchanged worried glances, but Joseph offered no explanations, just a curt nod and a retreat into his own increasingly uncomfortable body. The thought of seeing a doctor, of becoming a patient, filled him with a strange, almost visceral dread. He, Joseph, the healer, the meticulous caregiver, reduced to a collection of symptoms, a case study to be analyzed. It felt like a profound betrayal of his own rigorous self-sufficiency. He even considered ordering some lab tests himself, using his professional access. But the idea felt like a pathetic act of denial, a desperate attempt to maintain control over something that was clearly, frighteningly, spiraling beyond it. The tipping point came on a Tuesday morning, a day off he'd planned to spend organizing his medical journals. He was reaching for a book on his top shelf when a sudden blinding pain exploded in his upper abdomen, so intense it stole his breath. It felt like a hot, searing knife twisting deep inside him, doubling him over instantly. He crumpled to the floor, gasping, hands clutching his stomach as if to physically contain the agony. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his vision swam, and for the first time, a cold, unadulterated fear seeped into his bones, bypassing all his medical knowledge and professional detachment. This was not indigestion. This was not stress. This was something profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. When the pain finally receded, leaving him weak and nauseous, he lay there for a long time, staring at the perfectly aligned spines of his medical techs, their scientific certainty suddenly feeling utterly meaningless. The rationalizations had crumbled. The denial had shattered. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed the number for his own hospital's gastroenterology department. The doctor's office was clinically pristine, a stark contrast to the familiar chaos of his own ward. Joseph sat stiffly on the examination table, the thin paper gown feeling like a cruel joke. He had endured the battery of tests with a practiced stoicism. The blood work, the endoscopy, the CT scan. Each step felt less like a diagnostic procedure and more like an unraveling, a slow, methodical peeling back of layers until the raw, terrifying truth was exposed. Dr. Anya Sharma, his oncologist, was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a direct gaze. She sat opposite him, her expression a careful blend of empathy and professional gravity. The words she spoke were precise, clinical, yet each one landed like a hammer blow. "Joseph," she began, her voice soft but firm, "the results are in. It's stage 4 gastric adenocarcinoma." Joseph felt a strange detachment, as if the words were being spoken about someone else. Gastric adenocarcinoma. He knew what that meant. He'd seen the charts, learned the prognoses. His mind, the nurse's mind, immediately began to run through the textbook definitions, the typical progression. Dr. Sharma continued, her gaze unwavering, and the CT scan shows peritoneal carcinomatosis. The cancer has spread to the lining of your abdominal cavity. Peritoneal carcinomatosis. That was the grim part. The widespread dissemination that made surgery almost impossible, a clear indicator of advanced, aggressive disease. He felt a cold dread seep into his chest, Not just fear, but a profound, chilling sense of betrayal by his own body. He, the man who had meticulously cared for countless others, was now a host to this insidious, relentless enemy. "We're looking at palliative care, Joseph," Dr. Sharma said, her voice laced with genuine regret. "To manage your symptoms, improve your quality of life for as long as possible. We can discuss chemotherapy options, but given the stage and spread, the goal would be to slow progression, not cure. Palliative care. The medical euphemism for, there's nothing more we can do." Joseph felt a surge of anger, hot and bitter. Anger at the injustice, at the randomness, at the sheer audacity of his own cells turning against him. He who had lived such a clean, disciplined life, who had dedicated himself to health. It was a cruel cosmic joke. He looked around the sterile room, suddenly acutely aware of its clinical impersonality. This wasn't his ward, where he was in control, dispensing comfort and expertise. This was where he was the subject, the problem, the statistic. He, who had always prided himself on his unwavering logic, felt his rational mind battling a primal, visceral scream of disbelief and fear. Just as Dr. Sharma was explaining the next steps, the door to the office burst open, and Ilara rushed in, her face streaked with tears, her usually vibrant clothes looking oddly subdued against the clinical white. She must have called the hospital, worried by his absence from work, and somehow found him. "Joseph!" she cried, her voice choked with emotion, rushing to his side and taking his hand. Her touch felt alien, too warm, too soft. He pulled his hand back almost imperceptibly. "Ilara, please," he muttered, embarrassed by her emotional outburst in front of Dr. Sharma. She ignored him, her eyes wide and pleading. "Joseph, we can beat this. We have to. There are so many other ways. I've been researching. There's holistic healing, energy work, special diets." "My teacher," he said. Joseph cut her off, his voice flat, devoid of its usual calm authority. "Ilara, stop. This is cancer. Stage 4. It's not energy work. It's science, and it's grim. There are no magical cures." He felt a searing impatience, a frustration so profound it bordered on contempt. Her airy-fairy nonsense, which he usually just dismissed, now felt like a direct insult to the cold, hard medical reality he was facing. It was a desperate, unscientific fantasy, and he had no patience for it. Dr. Sharma cleared her throat, her expression sympathetic yet firm. "Ilara, perhaps we can discuss treatment options first. Joseph needs time to process this." Ilara's eyes, brimming with unshed tears, fixed on him. "But Joseph, you can't just give up. This isn't just about science, it's about your spirit." "My spirit," Joseph echoed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "My spirit is currently battling a tumor the size of a grapefruit, Ilara. Let's stick to facts." The words were harsher than he intended, but the anger, the fear, the profound sense of unfairness were boiling just beneath his carefully maintained composure. The scientific world, his world, had just delivered a death sentence, and Ilara, with her talk of energy and spirits, felt like a jarring, unhelpful intrusion into his carefully constructed, now crumbling reality. He just wanted to be alone with this devastating truth, to process it in the bleak, clinical silence of his own mind. The abrupt shattering of his ordinary life and self-perception was complete. The sterile, almost brutal efficiency of the oncology ward became Joseph's new normal. He'd witnessed countless patients endure chemotherapy, administering drugs with practiced precision, offering words of detached encouragement. Now he was the one slumped in the recliner, the cold IV drip a constant reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. The oncologist, a kind but clinical woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, had outlined the regimen with a sobering matter-of-factness. A cocktail of drugs designed to assault the rapidly dividing cancer cells, with the caveat that success was far from guaranteed. "It's about quality of life, Joseph," she'd said, her eyes meeting his with an almost painful empathy. "And buying time." Buying time? For what? The thought gnawed at him, a dull counterpoint to the nausea that became his constant companion. The first cycle was a blur of misery. The antiemetics offered little respite. Every scent, every taste, Every stray thought seemed to trigger a fresh wave of stomach-churning revulsion. Food, once a simple pleasure, became an enemy. He remembered with a pang of bitter irony how he'd once chided patients for their lack of appetite. Now the very thought of a mouthful of anything brought a cold sweat to his brow. He'd lost another 10 pounds in the first week of treatment, the gauntness of his face now alarming even to himself in the mirror. His meticulous home, once a sanctuary of order, slowly began to reflect the chaos within him. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the drawn blinds. Dishes piled in the sink, a subtle film of grease coating the pristine countertops. His beloved philodendrons, once vibrant and verdant, drooped sadly, their leaves yellowing from neglect. He simply lacked the energy, the will, to care. Getting out of bed felt like lifting a lead weight. Standing for more than a few minutes sent his head spinning. The fatigue was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating, pressing him down into the mattress, robbing him of thought, of ambition, of even the simplest desire to exist. Ilara, true to her word, had moved in. He hadn't asked her to, had in fact tried to dissuade her with a curt, "Don't be ridiculous, I'm perfectly capable." But she'd simply arrived with 2 suitcases and a quiet determination that brooked no argument. She moved through his neglected space like a silent, restorative current. She didn't press him with her airy-fairy nonsense, as he'd expected. Instead, she just was. She made bland broths he often couldn't swallow more than a spoonful of. She kept the house clean, though he barely noticed. She brought him lukewarm chamomile tea, her touch gentle as she helped him sit up. She opened the blinds, letting weak sunlight into the darkened rooms, murmuring about the light needing to come in. He'd just grunt, turning his face to the wall. One afternoon, during a particularly brutal wave of nausea, she sat by his bed, humming a soft, wordless tune. He found it irritating, a persistent buzzing in his already throbbing head. "Ilara," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. "Please, no." She stopped immediately, her face etched with concern. "Sorry, Joseph. Just thought it might soothe." "Nothing soothes," he bit out, then regretted the sharpness. He was so tired of being sick, so tired of being weak, so tired of this relentless, grinding despair. He hated the way his body had betrayed him, hated the way it had stripped him of his independence, his dignity. He hated the pity in Ilara's eyes, even though he knew it was born of love. He closed his eyes, wishing for unconsciousness. He could feel the cancer, a malevolent presence, a darkness inside. Not just a physical mass, but an encroaching shadow over his very being. It wasn't just the disease that was consuming him, but the self-pity, the bitterness, the silent rage at his own mortality. He was a nurse, a healer. He fixed things. How could he be so utterly broken? The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, metallic and acrid, like the lingering aftertaste of his chemotherapy. He knew the statistics, knew the prognosis for stage 4 gastric adenocarcinoma with peritoneal carcinomatosis. He was living it, every agonizing, nauseating, fatiguing moment. The time he was buying felt less like a gift and more like a prolonged torture. He was the expert, and the expert knew there was no escaping this, only enduring it until the end. The sterile, almost brutal efficiency of the oncology ward became Joseph's new normal. He'd witnessed countless patients endure chemotherapy, administering drugs with practiced precision, offering words of detached encouragement. Now he was the one slumped in the recliner, the cold V drip a constant reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. The oncologist, a kind but clinical woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, had outlined the regimen with a sobering matter-of-factness. A cocktail of drugs designed to assault the rapidly dividing cancer cells, with the caveat that success was far from guaranteed. "It's about quality of life, Joseph," she'd said, her eyes meeting his with an almost painful empathy. "And buying time." Buying time? For what? The thought gnawed at him, a dull counterpoint to the nausea that became his constant companion. The first cycle was a blur of misery. The antiemetics offered little respite. Every scent, every taste, every stray thought seemed to trigger a fresh wave of bile. The fatigue was a lead blanket, pressing him deeper into the mattress, making the simplest tasks, showering, getting dressed, even speaking, monumental efforts. His fastidious nature, once a source of quiet pride, became a distant memory. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, slanting through the windows of his meticulously curated home, now neglected, a silent testament to his failing grip on his own life. Ilara moved in, a whirlwind of quiet, persistent care. She navigated his kitchen, preparing bland, easily digestible meals he rarely touched. She changed his sheets, washed his clothes, and somehow always managed to be there with a cool cloth or a glass of water just as the nausea peaked. He rarely acknowledged her efforts, often just grunting or turning his head away. Her gentle attempts to introduce soothing music or diffuse essential oils were met with a weary sigh or a curt, "Please, Ilara, not now." He felt a profound self-pity, an overwhelming sense of betrayal by his own body. He, Joseph, the healer, the man of science, was reduced to this trembling, wasted shell. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, worse than the lingering metallic aftertaste from the chemo. As the weeks bled into months, Joseph's condition worsened. The ascites, the fluid buildup in his abdomen, became undeniable. His belly swelled, tight and distended, a grotesque parody of life. Dr. Sharma scheduled regular paracentesis procedures, the draining of the fluid, but each time the relief was fleeting. The fluid would return, slowly at first, then with alarming speed, pressing on his diaphragm, making every breath a shallow, painful gasp. He felt like a grotesque balloon, slowly but relentlessly inflating from the inside. This physical deterioration mirrored a profound crisis within him. It wasn't a crisis of spiritual faith, for he had none in that sense. His faith had always been in the tangible, the observable, the scientific method. But now that foundation had crumbled. He was a nurse, a healer, a man who had dedicated his life to understanding and mending the human body. Yet his own body had betrayed him, defying every medical intervention, every rational explanation. He had always been in control, meticulously planning, executing, problem-solving. Now he was utterly powerless, adrift in a sea of pain and uncertainty. This loss of control, coupled with the relentless physical agony, festered into a deep internal darkness. It wasn't just the cancer, though that was certainly a part of it. It was a profound sense of self-pity, of worthlessness. His identity as a healer, as a rational being, as a man who always had control, had been stripped away. He became profoundly withdrawn, retreating deeper into himself. The world outside his dimly lit bedroom became a blur, a distant hum he barely registered. When his former colleagues visited, bringing flowers or offering hesitant words of encouragement, Joseph could barely tolerate their presence. He saw pity in their eyes and it rankled. He saw their healthy, vibrant bodies, reminders of what he had lost, and it fueled his bitterness. He'd offer curt, one-word answers or simply turn his face to the wall, feigning sleep. Ilara, ever patient, would quietly usher them out, offering apologies he didn't feel. One afternoon, Ilara tried to engage him in conversation about an old black and white movie she'd put on. "It's a classic, Joseph, Casablanca. Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman." He snapped, his voice a raw, grating sound he barely recognized as his own. "What's the point, Ilara? What's the bloody point of any of it? You think some Hollywood fantasy is going to make this go away? You live in a fantasy world, with your crystals and your energy healing. It's all just smoke and mirrors, a way to avoid the brutal truth." Ilara flinched, her usual composure momentarily cracking. "Joseph, I'm just trying to..." "Trying to what?" he interrupted, the words spilling out, fueled by his despair. "Trying to pretend it's not happening? Trying to make me believe in some hocus pocus because science can't save me? Is that it? Because let me tell you, Ilara, there's no miracle here. There's just decay, and it's happening inside me, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, anyone can do." He turned away, the effort of the outburst leaving him breathless, his chest heaving. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he instinctively reached for the basin Ilara always kept nearby. The darkness inside him wasn't just the cancer. It was a profound sense of futility, a suffocating despair that made even the thought of living another day an unbearable burden. He had spent his life saving others, but he couldn't save himself. His life's work, his very purpose, felt like a cruel joke. He was a professional in the art of healing, yet here he was, staring into the abyss of his own inevitable demise, utterly helpless. The only thing he felt was the crushing weight of his own mortality, in a chilling void where purpose once resided. The sterile, almost brutal efficiency of the oncology ward became Joseph's new normal. He'd witnessed countless patients endure chemotherapy, administering drugs with practiced precision, offering words of detached encouragement. Now he was the one slumped in the recliner, the cold V drip a constant reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. The oncologist, a kind but clinical woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, had outlined the regimen with a sobering matter-of-factness, a cocktail of drugs designed to assault the rapidly dividing cancer cells, with the caveat that success was far from guaranteed. "It's about quality of life, Joseph," she'd said, her eyes meeting his with an almost painful empathy. "And buying time." Buying time. For what? The thought gnawed at him, a dull counterpoint to the nausea that became his constant companion. The first cycle was a blur of misery. The antiemetics offered little respite. Every scent, every taste, every stray thought seemed to trigger a fresh wave of revulsion. He began to associate his once pristine apartment, a sanctuary of order and quiet pride, with the constant low thrum of his own suffering. The crisp white sheets, now often damp with cold sweats, felt like a shroud. The meticulously organized spice rack, once a testament to his love of precise culinary arts, now mocked him with its array of aromas he couldn't bear. Ilara, bless her persistent, airy-fairy heart, had moved in. Her quiet presence a strange comfort, even as her attempts at soothing left him irritated. He'd snapped at her for burning incense, the scent, to his hypersensitive nose, a noxious cloud. He'd grumbled about the soft, reedy music she played, finding its gentle notes an unbearable intrusion on the cacophony of his own internal pain. The physical torment was relentless, but it was the profound sense of uselessness that truly began to hollow him out. His hands, once so skilled and steady, now trembled. His mind, once sharp and analytical, felt fogged, reduced to a primitive focus on the next wave of nausea, the next dull ache. He was no longer a healer, but a deteriorating specimen, a medical anomaly. The control he had always prided himself on, the meticulous organization that defined his life, had been violently stripped away. He lay in bed for days, the blinds drawn, the world outside a distant, irrelevant hum. The sight of his own emaciated reflection in the bathroom mirror, a gaunt stranger with hollow eyes and a sallow complexion, was a particular torment. This was what cancer did. It didn't just consume your body, it consumed your essence. The ascites, the fluid buildup in his abdomen, became a particularly cruel manifestation of his decline. His stomach, once lean and taut, distended grotesquely, a constant, uncomfortable pressure. It felt like a malevolent balloon swelling inside him, pressing against his lungs, making every breath a shallow effort. Dr. Sharma scheduled regular paracentesis procedures, where a needle was inserted into his abdomen to drain the fluid. The first time he watched, clinically detached, as gallons of yellowish fluid gurgled into plastic bags. It was a bizarre, humiliating spectacle. He, Joseph, the meticulous nurse, reduced to a vessel leaking his own internal misery. One afternoon, after a particularly arduous drainage, he lay exhausted, the residual ache making his entire abdomen feel bruised. Ilara had cleaned up the room, her movements soft and efficient. She had even managed to coax him into drinking a few sips of weak broth. He closed his eyes, drifting into a fitful sleep that quickly turned into a nightmarish landscape. He was lost in a vast, empty expanse, his body withered, transparent, like an empty husk. He tried to call out, but no sound emerged. The darkness inside that Ilara sometimes spoke of, the metaphorical self-absorption that accompanies severe illness, felt terrifyingly literal. It was consuming him, leaving nothing but a dried-out shell. He woke with a gasp, his heart pounding, a cold sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. The nausea was back, a relentless tide. He stumbled to the bathroom, retching until his throat burned. When he emerged trembling, he saw Ilara through the window, kneeling in his neglected garden. Weeds had overtaken the precise rows of herbs he once tended with such care. The rose bushes, usually pruned to perfection, were overgrown and leggy. She was methodically pulling weeds, her back to him, her movements slow and deliberate, a small, defiant act of order against the chaos that had overtaken his life. A strange, almost desperate sound escaped his throat. "Ilara?" It was a raw, thin whisper, barely audible, but she straightened, turning slowly. Her face, usually so open and serene, held a flicker of surprise, then a gentle attentiveness. She didn't rush to him. She just waited, her gaze steady. He felt a profound exhaustion, an emptiness that dwarfed even the physical pain. He sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching the worn blanket. The words felt alien, a betrayal of all his rational principles. Yet they emerged, fragmented and fragile. "Tell me," he began, his voice raspy. "Tell me about your retreats, about what you believe." He didn't ask for healing, not directly. He asked for an explanation, for a glimpse into the world she inhabited, so utterly different from his own. Ilara walked to the doorway, her hands still smudged with soil. She didn't preach, didn't launch into a sermon. Instead, her voice was soft, almost conversational. "Joseph," she said, her eyes meeting his with an understanding that transcended words. "True healing, it's not always about what we gain for ourselves. Sometimes it begins when we find a way to give back, even in the smallest way. It's about letting the light out, not just trying to pull it in." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window, to the garden she was slowly reclaiming. "It's not about curing the body, Joseph, not always. Sometimes it's about tending to the spirit, especially when you feel the most withered." She didn't mention his cancer, only his spirit, his profound internal emptiness. Her words, so simple, so unscientific, resonated with a strange, fragile truth in the suffocating silence of his despair. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred within him, a nascent curiosity that pricked at the edges of his hardened cynicism. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. The sterile, almost brutal efficiency of the oncology ward became Joseph's new normal. He'd witnessed countless patients endure chemotherapy, administering drugs with practiced precision, offering words of detached encouragement. Now he was the one slumped in the recliner, the cold IV drip a constant reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. The oncologist, a kind but clinical woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, had outlined the regimen with a sobering matter-of-factness. A cocktail of drugs designed to assault the rapidly dividing cancer cells, with the caveat that success was far from guaranteed. "It's about quality of life, Joseph," she'd said, her eyes meeting his with an almost painful empathy. "And buying time. Buying time, for what?" The thought gnawed at him, a dull counterpoint to the nausea that became his constant companion. The first cycle was a blur of misery. The antiemetics offered little respite. Every scent, every taste, every stray thought seemed to trigger a fresh wave of revulsion. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even summon the will to shower. His carefully ordered life had devolved into a chaotic mess, mirroring the chaos within his own failing body. Ilara, despite his constant, weary dismissals, had moved in, her quiet presence a steady anchor in his turbulent sea of illness. She'd tried aromatherapy, gentle music, even just sitting silently beside him, holding his hand. He'd mostly tolerated it, too exhausted to argue. Then came the ascites. His abdomen swelled, tight and distended, a grotesque parody of his once trim physique. The fluid buildup pressed against his diaphragm, making every breath a shallow, painful effort. Dr. Sharma scheduled regular paracentesis procedures, the long needle a cold, sharp reminder of his body's betrayal. The first time, he'd watched the clear, yellow fluid drain into the collection bag, a part of him still observing with clinical detachment, another part screaming in silent terror. It was during one particularly agonizing session, the pressure in his belly relentless even after leaders had been removed, that the true crisis hit. He was no longer Joseph, the meticulous nurse, the man in control. He was a vessel, a broken machine, leaking and failing. The darkness inside wasn't just the cancer, it was a suffocating shroud of self-pity, hopelessness, and a profound sense of uselessness. He snapped at Alara, his voice thin and reedy. "Stop with your crystals, Alara. Stop with your healing energy. It's all nonsense. I'm dying, can't you see that? And all your airy-fairy bullshit isn't going to change it." Alara had flinched but didn't back down. "It's not about changing it, Joseph. It's about how you face it." But her words were lost in the maelstrom of his despair. He pushed away his former colleagues who tried to visit, their sympathetic faces feeling like an accusation. What was the point of a life spent healing others if he couldn't even heal himself? The question echoed in the hollow chamber of his mind. One evening, the nausea was particularly relentless. He'd barely kept down a sip of water all day. Sleep offered no escape. Instead, he was tormented by a vivid, unsettling dream. He saw himself in his neglected garden, not tending to the vibrant roses, but shriveled, a withered, empty husk, the life drained from him, leaving only dust. He woke with a gasp, the taste of bile in his mouth, the image of his own decay seared into his mind. He lay there for a long time, the familiar ache in his abdomen a constant throb. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator. He could hear the faint rhythmic snip of shears outside. Alara, still out there, tending to his neglected garden, the garden he once poured his heart into, now a symbol of his inner decay. He pushed himself up, the effort monumental, and shuffled to the window. The twilight cast long shadows. Alara was bent over a rose bush, carefully pruning away dead wood, her silhouette outlined against the fading light. A sudden, raw sound escaped his throat. "Alara!" It was barely a whisper, hoarse and breaking, a plea he hadn't known he was capable of making. Alara straightened, turning slowly, her eyes wide with surprise and concern. She walked towards the back door, wiping her hands on her trousers. He didn't ask for spiritual healing. He couldn't. His rational mind still rebelled against it. But something had cracked open within him. The utter exhaustion, the vivid dream of his own emptiness, had finally broken through his rigid resistance. "Tell me," he rasped, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "Tell me about your retreats, about what you believe." Alara didn't rush. She didn't preach. She just looked at him, her expression a mixture of profound relief and quiet understanding. She came inside, sat on the edge of his worn armchair, careful not to jostle him. "Joseph," she began, her voice soft but steady, "my retreats, they aren't about magic cures. They're about finding connection to yourself, to others, to something bigger than yourself." She paused, her gaze holding his. "True healing, I've learned, often begins when you find a way to give back, even in the smallest way, even when you feel you have nothing left to give." She didn't mention his cancer, only his spirit. The darkness inside sometimes is just a shadow cast by focusing too much on what you can't control. But the light comes from within when you share what you have, no matter how little. Her words resonated not with logic, but with a fragile, nascent hope. The concept of giving back, of purpose. It was a language he understood, a fundamental truth that had driven him his entire life until now. The idea that even in his broken state, he might still offer something. The thought was a tiny flicker, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It wasn't about curing himself, not directly. It was about finding a reason to be, even if that being was a frail, pain-racked shadow of his former self. He lay awake long after Alara had gone to bed, her words swirling in his mind. Giving back, purpose. He couldn't be a surgical nurse. He couldn't even stand for long, but he could still be present. He thought of the hospice down the road, the serene building where he'd occasionally consulted on patient care. A place where healing wasn't about cure, but about comfort, dignity, and connection in the face of the ultimate unknown. By morning, the flicker had grown into a fragile, insistent flame. Alara was in the kitchen, making him a ginger tea when he shuffled in, his face still pale, but his eyes holding a new, tentative light. "Ilara," he said, his voice stronger than she'd heard it in weeks. "I have an idea." She looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern, unsure what to expect. "I want to volunteer at the hospice," he stated, the words feeling both absurd and profoundly right. "Just a few hours a week. I can't nurse, but I can read or help with paperwork. Anything." He paused, looking at her, a strange, almost fearful earnestness in his gaze. "I need to do something. I need to be useful again." Ilara's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. "Joseph, are you sure? Your health—" "I know," he interrupted, a flicker of his old determination in his voice. "But I can't just lie here. I can't. This darkness inside—" He gestured vaguely at his stomach. "It needs to go. And maybe this is how." Ilara, after a moment of quiet contemplation, nodded, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "Then we'll make it happen." The hospice director, a kind but initially skeptical woman named Martha, listened patiently as Ilara explained Joseph's background and his unusual request. Martha looked at Joseph, thin and gaunt, leaning heavily on Ilara, and her expression was guarded. But something in Joseph's eyes, a quiet dignity amidst the frailty, seemed to sway her. "We can start with a few hours, perhaps reading to some of our patients," she offered, her voice soft but firm. "See how you feel." Joseph's first day at the hospice was a monumental effort. He wore a clean, pressed shirt, a ghost of his former nursing uniform, and despite the dull ache in his abdomen, a sense of quiet purpose settled over him. Martha led him to a brightly lit room where an elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson, lay propped up in bed, her eyes closed. "Mrs. Henderson loves poetry," Martha whispered. Joseph sat beside her bed and, with a surprisingly steady hand, opened the worn book Martha had given him. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice surprisingly clear, if a little weak, filling the quiet room with the rhythmic beauty of Tennyson. As he read, he felt a strange, almost electric current pass through him. It wasn't about curing his cancer. It was about being present, about giving, even when he felt utterly depleted. The darkness inside didn't vanish, not yet, but for the first time in a very long time, a tiny crack of light seemed to pierce through it. The initial days at St. Jude's Hospice had brought a fragile flicker to Joseph's eyes, a faint echo of the meticulous nurse he once was. He'd found a rhythm in reading aloud, his voice, though weaker than before, steadying as he brought stories to life for patients too frail to hold a book. He'd even managed a few tentative smiles, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards, a gesture Ilara hadn't seen in months. But the reprieve was short-lived. The familiar, insidious ache in his abdomen returned with a vengeance, sharper, more insistent than before. The subtle swelling he'd learned to ignore in his periphery began to distend his belly rapidly, a grotesque, taut drum. One afternoon, while reading a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea to Mrs. Henderson, a former English teacher with rheumy eyes, Joseph felt a sudden, searing cramp that doubled him over, a gasp escaping his lips. The book slipped from his trembling fingers, and a cold sweat instantly coated his skin. Ilara, who had been quietly knitting in a nearby chair, was at his side in an instant. "Joseph, what is it?" Her voice was laced with alarm. He couldn't answer, his body racked with a pain that eclipsed even the brutal chemotherapy. He felt himself losing consciousness, the room spinning into a blurry tunnel. The last thing he heard before the darkness claimed him was Mrs. Henderson's faint, concerned voice. Poor dear, he was just getting to the part about the big fish. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, the shrill wail of an ambulance, and the hurried clipped voices of paramedics. Joseph was back in the sterile, unforgiving environment of the emergency room, the place he knew so intimately from the other side of the gurney. Dr. Sharma, looking even more somber than usual, stood over him, her face etched with concern. "It's severe ascites, Joseph. You're retaining a significant amount of fluid, and your electrolyte balance is critically off. We're seeing signs of rapid progression." Her words, though professional, carried an undeniable weight. She didn't need to elaborate. He knew what rapid progression meant. His body was failing, quickly. They performed an emergency paracentesis, draining liters of cloudy yellow fluid, offering temporary relief from the crushing pressure. But the relief was fleeting. His body, as if in defiance, began to refill almost immediately. The pain, even with increased doses of opioids, was a relentless tide, ebbing only slightly before crashing over him again. He was moved to the ICU, hooked up to a tangle of tubes and wires, the omnipresent beeps and alarms of the machines, a cruel symphony. Ilara was a steadfast presence at his bedside, her hand often resting gently on his forehead, a cool, comforting weight. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his thoughts fragmented, hallucinatory at times. He saw Mrs. Henderson, her eyes still fixed on the unfinished story, and Mr. Davies, the quiet, elderly man he'd read poetry to, their faces a melange of concern and anticipation. He could almost hear Santiago's struggle with the Marlin, the heroic fight against an insurmountable foe. During one fleeting moment of lucidity, his eyes fluttered open. He saw Ilara, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He tried to speak, his throat dry and scratchy. "Ilara," he croaked, the sound barely a whisper. She leaned closer, her ear almost touching his lips. "I'm here, Joseph." "The book," he managed, the words a monumental effort. "Mrs. Henderson, tell her, I'm sorry, couldn't finish it." His voice trailed off, his eyes closing again. The thought of leaving that story unfinished, of disappointing those frail, hopeful patients, pierced him deeper than any physical pain. It was a regret not for his own life, not for the career he'd lived, but for the connections he was about to sever, the small, profound acts of service he was abandoning. Ilara's breath hitched. She squeezed his hand, her own trembling. She looked at his gaunt face, the visible struggle for each breath, the barely perceptible pulse fluttering beneath his skin. The medical team had been blunt. It was a matter of hours, perhaps a day at best. Yet as she held his hand, a strange sensation washed over her. It wasn't a physical heat or a tangible light, but an almost palpable presence, a profound peace emanating from him. It was as if, even as his physical form was consumed by the disease, something immense and luminous within him was not only untouched but growing, a quiet, radiant strength that transcended the body's failing. It was the light he was bringing to others, now somehow reflecting back on him, not as a cure, but as a final, profound testament to his spirit. The doctors made their rounds, their faces etched with professional resignation. Dr. Sharma adjusted his pain pump, her touch gentle, her gaze compassionate. "He's comfortable now, Ilara," she said, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. "We'll continue to manage his pain." There was nothing else they could do. The abyss yawned, and Joseph, at the very edge, was consumed not by fear for himself, but by a quiet, profound regret for the stories he couldn't finish. The blinding white lights of the emergency room were a jarring contrast to the dim, comforting solace of the hospice library. Joseph registered the frantic movements of nurses and doctors as disembodied blurs, their voices a muffled cacophony. The pain was a living entity, consuming him, each breath a struggle against its suffocating grip. He felt the familiar pressure of ascites, far worse than before, now a crushing weight against his diaphragm, stealing his air. Dr. Sharma's face, etched with a grim prognosis, floated in and out of his fading consciousness. He heard words like rapid progression, peritoneal burden, comfort measures. He knew what they meant. He'd spoken them himself countless times to patients and their families. This was the end. Yet even as the world around him narrowed to a pinpoint of agony, his thoughts drifted to Mrs. Henderson, her bright, intelligent eyes. He had promised to finish. The old man and the sea, and Mr. Davies, with his quiet humor and love for history, had been looking forward to the next chapter of the Roman Empire's fall. A profound regret, not for his own dying, but for these unfinished connections, gnawed at him more fiercely than the cancer. "Ilara," he rasped, his voice a dry, papery whisper. A cool hand, impossibly gentle, found his. He felt the distinct tremor in her touch, the fear radiating from her. "The book, Tell Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry, couldn't finish. He tried to conjure the words to explain the profound disappointment of leaving these stories untold, these moments unshared, but the words dissolved into the pain, and he felt himself slipping into a dark, swirling void. He was aware of Ilara's soft sobbing, the hushed, urgent voices of the medical team, and then, mercifully, nothing. He awoke to a world that felt both alien and intimately familiar. The hospital room was still sterile white, but the urgent rhythm had softened. The sharp edges of pain were dulled, replaced by a persistent ache, a ghost of its former self. He blinked, the fluorescent light still harsh but no longer unbearable. The crushing weight on his chest was gone. He took a deep breath, and it felt fuller, less labored than any he'd taken in months. Ilara was slumped in a chair beside his bed, her face pale and streaked with dried tears, her hair a wild tangle. She looked exhausted, like she'd been through a war. Her head snapped up as he stirred, and her eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto his. "Joseph?" she whispered, her voice raw. He tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. She was instantly by his side, pressing a cup of ice chips to his lips. The cool water was a revelation, refreshing a parched throat he hadn't realized was so dry. "What happened?" he managed, his voice still weak but discernible. Ilara's eyes welled up again. They thought you were going. Your ascites was critical. Your organs were shutting down. Dr. Sharma said. She said there was nothing more they could do but keep you comfortable." Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they seemed to be tears of bewildered relief. "But then, you just stabilized. Overnight, the ascites started to recede on its own. Your pain medication, they were able to reduce it. It doesn't make any sense." Joseph lay there absorbing her words, a strange mixture of confusion and a nascent, fragile hope stirring within him. He felt lighter, not just physically, but as if a profound, internal burden had been lifted. The darkness that had consumed him, the oppressive cloak of despair and self-pity, was no longer a suffocating presence. It had receded, like the fluid from his abdomen. Dr. Sharma arrived later that morning, her usual clinical demeanor replaced by an expression of professional bewilderment. She examined him meticulously, palpating his abdomen, listening to his chest. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Joseph, this is remarkable," she said, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief. "Your ascites has reduced by over 60% in less than 24 hours. Your liver enzymes, which were critically elevated, are showing significant improvement. Your pain markers are down. We've sent for repeat imaging, but I have no medical explanation for this. None." The repeat scans, performed with a sense of urgent curiosity by the medical team, only deepened their perplexity. The images, flashed onto the screen in his room, spoke for themselves. The bloated, cauliflower-like masses of peritoneal carcinomatosis that had choked his abdominal cavity were dramatically reduced. Some areas showed only wispy remnants, others were gone entirely. The primary gastric tumor, while still present, appeared significantly smaller. Its irregular edges softened, almost deflated. Dr. Sharma stared at the scans, then at Joseph, then back at the images, her expression a mix of awe and scientific frustration. This is what we call a spontaneous regression," she finally stated, her voice hushed. "It's exceedingly rare in stage 4 adenocarcinoma, especially this aggressive. We see it sometimes in very specific types of cancer, but not like this. Not to this extent, not with these markers. Mr. Davies, our chief of oncology, wants to review these himself. He's calling it unprecedented." Joseph listened, a quiet understanding dawning within him. He saw the baffled expressions of the doctors, their desperate search for a logical, scientific explanation. But he knew. He remembered Ilara's gentle words in his lowest moment. True healing often begins when one finds a way to give back, even in the smallest way. He remembered the profound regret he felt for the hospice patients, for the unfinished stories, for the connections he had forged and then seemingly abandoned. In that moment of utter physical and spiritual defeat, his focus had shifted entirely from himself to others. The darkness inside, and he realized, wasn't just the cancer. It was the self-absorption, the relentless focus on his own pain, his own dying. When that focus had fractured, when his last thoughts were of giving, of serving, of completing his small new purpose, something fundamental had shifted. He looked at Ilara, her face still tear-stained, but now alight with a hesitant joy. He offered her a weak but genuine smile. "The darkness inside," he whispered, his voice gaining strength with each word. It retreated, like a shadow shying away from light. He hadn't sought a cure for himself, not truly. He had sought to serve, and in serving he had found something far more profound than just healing. He had found a new life, a new understanding that the light he brought to others had somehow, miraculously, illuminated the darkness within himself. The blinding white lights of the emergency room were a jarring contrast to the dim, comforting solace of the hospice library. Joseph registered the frantic movements of nurses and doctors as disembodied blurs, their voices a muffled cacophony. The pain was a living entity, consuming him, each breath a struggle against its suffocating grip. He felt the familiar pressure of ascites, far worse than before, now a crushing weight against his diaphragm, stealing his air. Dr. Sharma's face, etched with a grim prognosis, floated in and out of his fading consciousness. He heard words like rapid progression, peritoneal burden, comfort measures. He knew what they meant. He'd spoken them himself countless times to patients and their families. This was the end. Yet even as the world around him narrowed to a pinpoint of agony, his thoughts drifted to Mrs. Henderson, her bright, intelligent eyes. He had promised to finish The Old Man and the Sea. And Mr. Davies, with his quiet humor and love for poetry, he'd meant to bring him that anthology of Frost. Shame, not for his own dying, but for the unfinished connections, pricked at him. He tried to speak, a raspy whisper escaping his lips. Ilara, Mrs. Henderson, the book. Ilara, her face streaked with tears, leaned close. "I know, Joseph. I know. I'll go. I'll tell her you're sorry you couldn't finish it." Her hand found his, cool and firm. As she held it, a strange, almost imperceptible warmth spread from her touch. Not a physical heat, but a wave of profound, inexplicable peace. For a moment, the searing pain seemed to recede, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He saw not the stark hospital room, but the serene faces of the hospice patients, their gratitude, their quiet strength. A faint, almost luminous light seemed to emanate from within him, a peace that transcended the physical devastation. Then, the darkness claimed him. When Joseph opened his eyes again, the harsh glare of the ICU lights was still present, but the suffocating weight on his chest had eased. A nurse, a young man he didn't recognize, was adjusting his IV. The pain, still there, was no longer a consuming fire, but a dull, insistent ache. His mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. He took a tentative breath, then another. No gasping, no struggle. Dr. Sharma appeared an hour later, her expression a mix of bewilderment and professional awe. "Joseph," she began, her voice carefully modulated, "I don't know how to explain this. Your ascites? It's significantly reduced. We're seeing a spontaneous diuresis. Your pain markers are down. And your labs, frankly, they're confounding us." Over the next few days, the medical team continued to be baffled. Joseph's improvement wasn't just stabilization. It was a clear, undeniable reversal. The fluid in his abdomen continued to recede rapidly. His appetite, a distant memory for months, flickered, then steadily returned. He ate small, bland meals without nausea, the first solid food he'd truly enjoyed since before his diagnosis. His strength, though still fragile, began to rebuild in slow, steady increments. A follow-up CT scan, ordered with a mixture of hope and skepticism, delivered the astonishing news. The large tumor burden, the extensive peritoneal carcinomatosis that had painted such a grim picture, had dramatically shrunk. In some areas, it was almost undetectable. "Spontaneous regression," Dr. Sharma finally conceded, shaking her head in disbelief during one of her rounds. "It's rare, incredibly rare for this type of cancer at this stage. We have no medical explanation, Joseph." Joseph nodded slowly, a quiet smile gracing his lips. He didn't need a medical explanation. He simply knew. He remembered the suffocating despair, the internal darkness that had been as corrosive as the cancer itself. He remembered the flicker of purpose, the fragile hope when he decided to give back, even in his own brokenness. He remembered reading to Mrs. Henderson, the quiet joy of connecting, of serving, of bringing a moment of peace to another. The darkness had been the cancer, yes, but also the self-absorption, the inward turning, the focus on his own suffering. As he had brought light to others, that internal darkness had, quite literally, dissipated. The idea wasn't scientific, not in the way he'd always understood it, but it was true. Released from the hospital, Joseph didn't return to his meticulously organized home and his life as a retired ailing nurse. He returned to St. Jude's Hospice, not as a patient, but as a full-time volunteer coordinator and patient advocate. He was thinner, yes, and his steps were slower than they once were, but his eyes held a depth, a quiet luminescence they never had before. He wore a simple hospice name tag that read, Joseph Volunteer. He didn't preach about miracles, nor did he claim any special spiritual insights. Instead, he simply shared his story, a testament to the profound power of human connection and purpose. I tried to save myself, he'd tell new volunteers or skeptical families, his voice soft but unwavering, and I failed. It wasn't until I stopped trying to save myself, until I focused on giving, on being present for others, that I truly began to heal. The darkness inside me, it wasn't just the disease, it was the focus on me. When I brought light to others, it had nowhere to hide. Ilara, now a constant, cherished presence in his life, worked alongside him. Their bond, forged in the crucible of his illness, was unbreakable. Together, they established the Joseph's Light Foundation, a small grassroots initiative focused on supporting holistic well-being in hospices, art therapy, music, guided meditation, and even simply ensuring patients had someone to read to them. They championed the idea that true healing encompassed not just the body, but the mind and spirit, and that human connection was often the most potent medicine of all. Joseph, the meticulous surgical nurse who had once dismissed anything unscientific as airy-fairy nonsense, now walked the halls of the hospice, a living embodiment of hope. He wasn't just a nurse anymore. He was a beacon, his own life a quiet, profound testament to the transformative power of selfless service. He had been healed, not by a cure he sought for himself, but by the light he had dared to share with others. And in that sharing, the darkness inside him had vanished, leaving only a quiet, boundless peace.